Hello, everybody, and welcome to Lecture 2 with Dr. Tom on the American Civil War. So today's lecture is going to focus exclusively on the 1830s. And this decade is very different from the 1820s in the sense that it's going to be a lot more violent. And it's also going to move into the issues of the national economy. So if you look here on this first slide, you'll notice there are two sketches from the time. The one on the left is one I want to look at first, and that is, well, a slave insurrection, as some would call it, a massacre, as some would call it, also a rebellion in the name of freedom, according to others. So we will look at what sort of rebellions or insurrections, whichever you wish to call them, took place in this time. But also look at the image on the right, and you will see that there is a problem going on. And if you look at the staircase in which the man in the middle is standing on, the second step from the bottom, SC Ordinance, SC South Carolina. The bottom step says nullification. So this is the Tariff Crisis of the 1830s, which we'll be looking at today. So the steps from bottom to top: nullification. The state of South Carolina is going to try to nullify all the tariffs of the duties that South Carolina is paying the federal government. And this is going to lead to accusations of treason. The next step up. And of course, if you follow up the staircase, you'll see civil war, deception, disunion. These are basically what a lot of people are afraid that the nullification crisis is going to lead to, with South Carolina refusing to abide by the policies of the federal government. And the guy in the middle, reaching up to the crown, and above it, despotism. Now, the guy to his right, telling him to reach a little further, Cal. Well, who is Cal? We'll go into full details of who he is in this lecture as well. One more thing before we change slides. You look down at the bottom and you see the swords put through two people. One of them has got a banner wrapped around him saying the Constitution. The other one, E Pluribus Unum, which is Latin, obviously, and that is the Latin motto for the United States, the Union. So the argument here, as you can very clearly see, is that South Carolina's nullification is going to lead to disunion and also destruction of the U.S. Constitution if they are allowed to succeed. Okay, so let's move on. So a bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about. And the 1830s is when you can see Southerners becoming very insecure about their future as a region. Also of their economy, and in some ways also even their own personal safety. And this is fueled initially by the Missouri Compromise, which we of course went into full details about in the previous lecture. And just as a reminder, it resulted in two states entering the Union. Missouri entered as a slave state, which angered a lot of northern politicians, and as a result, a new state in the Northeast, Maine, a breakaway from Massachusetts, was allowed to enter the Union as a free state. And this maintained the balance of free and slave states in the American Union, which also meant there was an equal number of northern and southern senators in the United States Senate, which of course is the upper chamber in Congress. We also will be looking at William Lloyd Garrison, a very prominent abolitionist who is going to become a household name in 1831. That same year, there will be a slave insurrection or slave rebellion, whichever term you wish to use. But we'll also have to look back, because this rebellion, insurrection, is not going to be the first attempt at such. This one will actually be carried out. But we need to look at previous ones before we look in depth at this one. And of course, the nullification crisis, which we've been talking about in regards to that satirical cartoon in the previous slide of 1832 to 33. Now, The alarming events of 1802 to 1831. So obviously we're focusing on the 1830s today, particularly regards to the gentleman on the right in the painting. That is Nat Turner of Southampton County, Virginia, a slave. Now let's look at the sketch on the far left. That is Gabriel Prosser of Henrico County, Virginia. Henrico County is just north of Richmond, and Henrico is a tobacco county. Gabriel Prosser was a slave, and he attempted to lead a slave rebellion. This slave rebellion was to take place not just around Richmond, but across the entire Commonwealth of Virginia. So what does this mean? This means that you're going to have to coordinate a lot. You're going to have to pull in a lot of subordinate officers, use that term, in order to help cause the insurrection to break out in other counties. And there are quite a lot of counties in Virginia, so this is a big task. And Gabriel Prosser started planning this rebellion in 1800. It is discovered in 1802. And that's why it didn't succeed. Gabriel Prosser spent too much time preparing this insurrection. He spent too much time putting together too many meetings, involving too many people. And eventually, some of these slaves will pass on this information to people that Gabriel Prosser doesn't want them to. And as a result, this planned rebellion is found out. And Prosser, of course, is going to be executed for this, as will 25 other slaves, mostly in the Richmond area, as a result. So that's a failed rebellion. So let's shift to the image in the middle. That is Denmark Vesey. He's in Charleston, South Carolina. That statue of his is actually in Hampton Park, which is not in the touristy area of Charleston, I should say. It's more up towards the Citadel. And Denmark Vesey was not a slave. He had been a slave in his life at the time of the rebellion that he is going to lead. He was not a slave. He had bought his freedom. He was serving as a carpenter in Charleston, South Carolina. All right, now again, like Gabriel Prosser's situation, this planned rebellion in 1822 is going to be found out. There's going to be one particular slave named Peter Prioleau, and Peter Prioleau is going to tell his master about this planned insurrection. And his master is Judge Samuel Prioleau. Well, the city of Charleston very promptly got prepared for it, arrested everybody who was involved, including Denmark Vesey. A total of 35 slaves and free blacks were hanged as a result of this rebellion. Planned rebellion, obviously, because it did not succeed. And so again, it shows that slave rebellions are very difficult to plan, because in order for them to be successful, you have to have a lot of slaves or free people involved who will participate. The more people, the more likely it is one of them is going to say it in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the wrong person's going to hear it. And therefore, the rebellion will be put down. And these planned rebellions are put down very harshly, unsurprisingly. But in 1831, Nat Turner, a slave in Southampton County, another tobacco-rich county where slavery was prominent, south of the James River in Virginia. Nat Turner was a slave who claimed that he had a good master who had never treated him badly. But Nat Turner taught himself how to read and write. So obviously a very intelligent man. Now, Nat Turner's owner had a study which was basically a small library, and he had a lot of books. A lot of them were theology, some were history, some were philosophy. and Nat Turner would often sneak in there and start reading. And the philosophy books are the ones that seem to push him over the edge and make him decide that he didn't like his situation as a slave and therefore wanted to do something about it. He also read at least large portions of the Bible and was very much influenced by, yes, Jesus Christ, and how Jesus had given his life for others. Nat Turner thought he could largely do the same for those who are living in bondage in Southampton County in the immediate sense, and perhaps this rebellion was spread to neighboring counties throughout Virginia and perhaps beyond. But Nat Turner decided that he wanted to do something about his situation, about his friend's situation, and so he took action. With this insurrection took place in and around what is now called Cortland, which is the county seat for Southampton County. Back then Cortland was called Jerusalem, and so it was around that area. And the eventual goal that Nat Turner set for himself was to take Jerusalem, and with that, then have the rebellion move elsewhere. This is one of the houses where the insurrection took place, the Whitehead House. And the white occupants of this house were brutally murdered. Swords, axes, knives, anything the slaves could find. And it was a rather large group. Edward's house is another one. The same thing happened. Now, I need to point out that Nat Turner set his targets not just on slave owners, on whites in general. Now, when I say whites, I don't mean just white men either. Women and even children were targeted. In fact, there was a particular incident where Nat Turner has sent a group of slaves to one of the houses in order to kill the whole family. And Nat Turner did know that there was a small infant in a crib in the house, and the slaves decided to not kill the baby in the crib and to just leave it laying there. And they left the house. And when they went back to report to Nat Turner that they had killed everyone in the house except for the small infant, Nat Turner did order them to go back to kill the baby. And so one slave went back there, his name's Will, and he did kill the baby with an axe. So Nat Turner, freedom fighter, yes. Killing babies, that makes you think there is absolutely a good chance that there's also some evil in him. Whites fled their houses, and this was the rallying point. It was called Mahone's Tavern, and that is present day still there in Cortland, Virginia today. Of course, remember back then, Cortland's Jerusalem. And the small balcony up there is where you had two white residents who were armed, who were ready to start shooting at any group that started running at the house. The insurrection participants were intercepted by a local militia group who did fight with them, engage with them, and a lot of the slaves were killed. A lot of them were also arrested. Nat Turner was eventually captured, and a place that to this day is referred to as Nat Turner's Cave. Nat Turner's Cave really was just basically a hole in the ground, and he had covered it with chopped down trees. And he was in there, and he had with him a sword at the time of his arrest. Nat Turner was put on trial, and we don't have the exact number, but we know that over 100 slaves were killed in the aftermath of Nat Turner's insurrection. Nat Turner was put on trial for the rebellion. In the testimony, which was recorded by Thomas Gray, he stated that he felt that God had told him to lead this insurrection. And he even stated that he had visions and looking in the air of white angels colliding with black angels. He said that he saw blood in the cornfield, and that he was told that when there was the setting, when there was an eclipse of the sun, that the insurrection was to begin. And that was a message from God to lead the insurrection. There was an eclipse of the sun that day. So that's a bit mysterious for sure. But that is what Nat Turner claimed, that God had told him to lead this insurrection. Nat Turner, unsurprisingly, is found guilty. He is ordered to be killed. There are varying reports as to what his execution involved. We know that he was hanged. We know that he was decapitated. We don't know exactly what happened with his body afterwards. Some reports state that he was decapitated and his body was thrown into the swamp. Others state that his body before decapitation was dragged through multiple towns in Southampton County, and people were invited to come out and whip him at each stop, and basically in every single town and village in Southampton County where he was dragged through. But we know that he was decapitated, and the skull supposedly was found in 2022 and is at the Smithsonian Institution right now, and is awaiting tests for confirmation to see if this is actually Nat Turner's skull. But there's no question about it. Nat Turner's insurrection, or rebellion, whichever you wish to call it, did what Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey failed to do. With Prosser and Vesey's rebellions being put down before they even began, that made a lot of white Southerners think, okay, this is scary, but at least we now know that slave rebellions would be very difficult to pull off. But Nat Turner did pull it off. And so this is going to scare a lot of people, and not just in Virginia. And that is absolutely crucial to understand. The entire South was terrified as a result of the insurrection, the Southampton insurrection, as it was called. And what is significant to point out is, of course, this happens in Virginia. Now, Virginia is not a deep South state. It's an upper South state. It is not a cotton state. It is a tobacco state. Now, for cotton, slave labor was deemed to be absolutely necessary because of the lack of tractors and things that we have today, which can be used to get all the cotton out of the fields. But even by 19th century standards, with tobacco plantations, it was deemed that slavery was beneficial for it, but it was not absolutely necessary. And so tobacco plantations did not have as many slaves typically as did cotton plantations. On top of that, that means that Virginia was not as big of a slave owning state as states further and deeper into the South, such as South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, which were the biggest ones. And there already had been some debate within Virginia, should we gradually abolish slavery as it's not economically necessary? Well, then Nat Turner's rebellion happened. And with that, discussions of gradual abolition stopped because there became a fear as what would ex-slaves do upon being set free? Would they leave? Would they go somewhere else? Would they stay? Would they keep working if they stayed? And if they do stay, will at least some of them want to seek revenge? Will they be violent? Will they kill our children? All these questions went through Virginians' minds, or white Virginians, I should say. And so as a result, all these talks about gradual abolition stopped. And because there's fear of what slaves might do if they were given freedom. And what a lot of white Southerners were aware of, even if they wouldn't speak about it openly, was that they knew that for, at this point, about 2 centuries, white Virginians have been treating black Virginians very badly. And there was certainly enough anger to go around for everybody. So there was concern that there would be enough freed blacks who would be angry enough to want to lead insurrections or rebellions against white authority in Virginia. And therefore, this is why Virginia dropped all talks of gradually getting rid of slavery within its borders. Now, we need to talk about this gentleman here, William Lloyd Garrison. So, interestingly, in 1831, the same year as Nat Turner's rebellion, Garrison starts the abolitionist newspaper titled The Liberator, which is published in New England, unsurprisingly. Garrison is from Boston. Now, The Liberator, which is going to be published in the same city, advocated immediate emancipation. And that was a big change for William Lloyd Garrison, because Garrison was not anti-abolition before 1831. He was in favor of gradual abolition. So, for example, setting a date in the future by which point all slaves would be set free, or set a date in the future by which any slaves born would be born free. That way, those who were already enslaved by that date would continue to be slaves, but as they got old and died, slavery would die with them. So that was Garrison's approach prior to 1831. And he also was in favor of slave owners being compensated for the loss of slaves if they do have to surrender them as their property before they die. And we get to 1831, early 1831, with the first publication of The Liberator. Garrison posts an article where he openly states that he has changed his views, and he now favors immediate abolition, that all slaves be set free immediately, and that no slave owner should be compensated for their sins. And he stated very clearly that his previous stance favoring gradual abolition was an economic stance, and that he thought that the immediate abolition of slavery would be bad for the American economy, because the economy would have to change too quickly, too radically, and the economy would not have time to adjust to that. Now, when we get to 1831, he's very clear that he does not think that the economic concerns should be addressed, that this is a moral crisis within the United States, and therefore it needs to be dealt with immediately. Slavery must be abolished immediately. Now, this was published shortly before Nat Turner's rebellion. Then Nat Turner's insurrection happened. Okay, so what's going to happen here is Garrison is going to have a price put on his head. Now, keep in mind, Nat Turner's rebellion takes place in Virginia. However, the state of Georgia is going to put a bounty on Garrison. They are going to put a price on his head, and anyone who is able to kidnap Garrison and bring him down to Georgia would get a handsome sum. So the state of Georgia wanted to put Garrison on trial in Georgia for crimes that they believed that he had set off in Virginia, which would have been very interesting. Obviously, it didn't happen, but Garrison was not responsible for Nat Turner's rebellion. They are independent from each other. It is ironic that they both took place in 1831 as far as the publication of the Liberator and the insurrection kicking off. But Garrison was not responsible for it. Okay, so let's then go over the South's main fears in the 1830s. One of them, of course, being the fact that even though the Missouri Compromise in 1820 did stop the slavery debate from boiling over, certainly did not result in a civil war breaking out, which is positive. The fact that Missouri entered as a slave state did appease Southerners for a short period. And the fact that Maine entered as a free state did appease Northern politicians for a short period. Okay, that's 1820. By 1830, the South is getting increasingly concerned that what American territory is below the Missouri Compromise line is almost negligible compared to the amount of land that is United States territory north of the Missouri Compromise line. As a result, there is concern that only so many more slave states could enter the Union, perhaps only 2 more. Meanwhile, the North can continue to bring in more free states, more and more and more, and eventually the South will be outnumbered. There will be more free states than slave states, therefore that means there will also be more anti-slavery senators than pro-slavery senators in the United States Senate. That could therefore result in a vote in Congress, which would perhaps even outlaw slavery itself in the United States. And should a president be unwilling to veto that bill, then it would happen. So we're starting to look at the South, is starting to look long term. So we have a real problem here. And there is already some talk by the time we get to 1830, but wouldn't it be nice if we could take some of that land that is Mexico's? And of course, today the Mexican border of the United States is much further south than it was. Mexico was a much bigger country in 1830 and included everything, including present day California, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Colorado, etc., etc. And so as a result, the American South is already looking at ways which they can perhaps get land from Mexico, even by force if necessary. The South also is noticing that abolitionist sentiment is growing in New England. The Liberator is the loudest voice of anti-slavery advocacy, but you've also got now a newly created American Anti-Slavery Society, AASS, and they are having meetings regularly to discuss what can be done to spread the idea of immediate emancipation. What can be done to get those who favor gradual abolition to move over across the line into favoring immediate emancipation? And at the same time, what can be done to abolish slavery in other states? What states could potentially get rid of slavery if we approach it the right way? Southerners were getting paranoid about that as well. And of course, unsurprisingly, the 2 planned revolts, which were put down before they took place by Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey, and the one that was orchestrated and did kick off in Virginia, led by Nat Turner, before it was put down by a militia group. So the South is getting very fearful of the future of slavery for their own safety, and also, therefore, for looking at the big picture, their economy. Now, I want to just have a quick review with this map of that first point, was the fact that the United States was expanding still west. However, they did not see in the South how slavery could continue to be spread west. Because if you see Missouri right smack in the middle of that map, nothing north of its southern border could ever enter the Union as a slave state. But there's so much territory that is American territory, especially that area that's labeled simply unorganized. That's the unorganized territory. All that could come into the Union as free states. The South has below that line basically present-day Oklahoma, and that's it. There's Florida, which is a territory. That could come in as a slave state. Not much else. But look at Mexico. Look at how much bigger it was in 1830. And that is why the South is looking at ways in which they can find a method of taking some of that land from Mexico, a lot of which would be south of that established Missouri Compromise line, which therefore could result in more slave states entering the Union. More on that later. Now we are going to move into the Nullification Crisis, which will be involving 2 of South Carolina's most famous sons. Okay, so we've got Andrew Jackson and John C. Calhoun. Andrew Jackson, born in South Carolina, but he does move out to Tennessee and makes his fortune out there as a plantation owner. And John C. Calhoun of Abbeville, South Carolina, and for a long time was revered in South Carolina as their greatest son, their greatest hero, one who stood up for them in the Nullification Crisis. He has fallen out of favor with many circles since then. And we will, of course, throughout the lectures go into why that was. But they're both South Carolinians. Andrew Jackson is the president during the Nullification Crisis. John C. Calhoun will be the vice president for the first part of it. Now, I'll also point out the fact that Andrew Jackson, John C. Calhoun are perhaps the two most dramatic looking politicians in American history. They both had these rather wild hairstyles. They dressed very dramatically. John C. Calhoun was so dramatic in the way that he dressed. He tended to wear a cape whenever outside to make him look very grand. But Andrew Jackson was no less keen on his appearance as well. That's something else we should. All right, now I want to start by talking about Andrew Jackson a bit. Andrew Jackson was born in Camden, South Carolina in 1767, and Camden, South Carolina, of course, is named after Camden in North London. And he had a very unhappy childhood, to say the least. His father died before he was even born. He did get to know his mother and his two brothers to an extent. Both of his brothers and his mother, all three died by the time he turned 14 years of age. So it was a very, very unhappy childhood that he had, and that had a long-term impact on him. He did serve in the American Revolution at the age of 13. He apparently was taken prisoner by the British when he was a drummer boy at that very young age, and had a scar on the side of his face, which, according to Jackson, was given to him by a British soldier with a bayonet. Now, we do know for a fact that Andrew Jackson, in 1806, did find out that a particular man had insulted his wife, so Andrew Jackson's response to that was to go out and kill him. So Andrew Jackson was very hot-headed, and he was not one who ever would run away from a fight. And that's going to be very crucial to understand when we get to the 1830s and to the Nullification Crisis. So looking at his political career, Andrew Jackson served for 2 years in Congress as a Republican. He served as a general in the War of 1812, and he was the one who was responsible for winning the Battle of New Orleans in 1815 in the last year of that war. So that is his principal claim to fame as a commanding officer in the United States Army. He was a plantation owner. He owned over 100 slaves, about 110. He grew cotton in Tennessee at a plantation called the Hermitage. He was the co-founder of the present-day Democratic Party, which was separate from the Democratic Republican Party, which existed before. So the Democratic Party today was founded in large part by Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson does serve as a Democratic president from 1829 to 1837. And another interesting factoid about Jackson is that prior to his presidency, all presidents came from the East Coast, particularly from Virginia and Massachusetts. Andrew Jackson will be the first president west of the Appalachian Mountains to be elected as president. That is the Hermitage. That is Andrew Jackson's plantation, a very handsome plantation house. And so, excuse me. And so therefore, you can see, how he had derived a great deal of wealth as a slave owner. And he had a reputation of being a very cruel slave owner. Now let's look at some images of Andrew Jackson from the War of 1812. There he is. I love how artists always show these great leaders pointing in the direction of the enemy as if the soldiers can't tell where they're coming from in the first place. And there he is again. The British are there. Yeah, no kidding. They're shooting at you, and you're already shooting at them. But that's that, and that's how artists love to make their heroes look extra dramatic, extra heroic. And of course, there are statues of Andrew Jackson across the United States. Jackson Square in New Orleans, which remains a controversial statue, one that continues to debate whether or not it should come down, as has been this one here in a roundabout directly in front of the White House. There is another equestrian statue with 4 cannons surrounding it. Now let's take a look at John C. Calhoun. I mentioned earlier he's from Abbeville, South Carolina, and Abbeville is a town. Back then it's also a county. So born in 1782, so he's a little bit younger than Andrew Jackson. He went to university in Connecticut, New England, Yale University, one of the top universities back then, also today. He did serve in the South Carolina state legislature very briefly before serving in the United States House of Representatives, so he then moved up to the national level. But he is going to serve in the cabinet of 3 American presidents. First, James Monroe, 1817 to 1825, a Democrat Republican. Another Democrat Republican, John Quincy Adams, 1825 to 1829. And then finally, Andrew Jackson, 1829 to 1832. Notice he does not serve the full 4 years of that term of Andrew Jackson's presidency. This is his plantation, Fort Hills it's called. So Calhoun also is a very wealthy cotton planter. Fort Hill is now part of the campus of today's Clemson University. Now, let's take a look at what the roots of the Nullification Crisis are. And there's another image of John C. Calhoun. And Calhoun had this very distinct look about him. He had these very powerful eyeballs that almost could penetrate walls. He was a very, very intense man. All right, so when John Quincy Adams, the 6th president of the United States, was president, he put a very high tariff on imports coming into all American ports. One of those ports, of course, is Charleston, South Carolina, from which a lot of my family comes from. And Andrew Jackson, when he replaces Adams as president, he did not state that he was going to remove those protective tariffs when he became president in 1829. And that concerned a lot of people, and particularly South Carolina. They did not want to continue to pay these federal tariffs. Now, Vice President John C. Calhoun, of course, is also from South Carolina. He starts to openly criticize his boss, the president. Now, this tariff was put in place by John Quincy Adams, who was from Massachusetts, primarily to protect the manufacturing industries based in New England from foreign competition, particularly the British and the French. And it did result in reciprocated tariffs by Britain. And that was deemed to be a problem by Calhoun, by the state of South Carolina, and some other southern states as well, because Britain was the biggest buyer of cotton from the American South. And so you have to keep in mind, a lot of times politicians do things not because it's the right thing to do, but it has to do with trying to find a way to boost their profile to help fulfill their future agenda when they climb further up the ladder or attempt to do so. And that's exactly what John C. Calhoun was trying to do. John C. Calhoun wanted to be president of the United States very badly, very badly. And he thought, if I'm going to be president, I'm from South Carolina. South Carolina support me, but I need to get the other southern states to support me too. So the southern states by this point are becoming increasingly skeptical of the federal government in Washington and feeling that they are starting to impede on the rights of the individual states. And the South back then, and to this day, has always been very big on state sovereignty, the rights of the individual states. And John C. Calhoun is the spokesman for that defense in the 1830s. Now, let's take a look at some proclamations. They're both going to issue proclamations because Calhoun is going to support South Carolina's nullifying these federal tariffs. And, well, Calhoun's going to say that the U.S. Constitution, yes, it exists. Yes, it's a good piece of paper, but it is an agreement. And agreements require two parties to be involved. Otherwise, this agreement has to be between two groups. And that agreement is between the federal government and the individual states, including his home state of South Carolina. And therefore, it cannot serve a governing entity created by a unified people. So remember, that's John C. Calhoun's views on states' rights. And Calhoun is very quick to point out that states have the right to make judgment for themselves over whether or not a federal law is exceeding the powers it is supposed to have as granted by the Constitution. And he went further to state that if any state, in this case South Carolina, deems that any federal law is unconstitutional and overstepping its boundaries, then that state has the right to nullify that law within its own borders. And that's exactly what South Carolina decided they were going to do. Now, Andrew Jackson, the president, decides that this is a real challenge to his authority. Now, keep in mind, this president is also a politician. Like Calhoun, he's got a pretty big ego, perhaps a bit insecure. So he's got to stand up for his position. He's got to defend his honor by as the leader of the federal government and defending the federal government, even if it's going against the state of his birth. And he said that South Carolina's nullification was a direct threat to that authority of the federal government. Therefore, it's also a threat to his authority. Egos. Right. So he issued a declaration publicly where he stated that there was a supremacy which the federal government had over the individual states, and said that this nullification crisis threatens disunion. And his direct quote is, "Disunion by armed force is treason," because South Carolina said that they would, if necessary, use state forces to enforce the nullification go through. And eventually, Andrew Jackson put forward the Force Bill in March 1833. And he said that he would use the military, the U.S. Army and Navy, to enforce the collection of all tariffs in the port of Charleston, South Carolina. Now, that's not going to be very well received in South Carolina, and John C. Calhoun was absolutely furious when he found this out. Now, Calhoun has his own publication called the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, an indication of what type of publication this is, a protesting one. And he, in this publication, said that the tariffs were unconstitutional. And he said that tariffs that were raised only for the purposes, these purposes benefited one region of the country, and that was New England. They were negligible to the South, and they harmed the South's economy. It harmed the cotton economy, and therefore the South should be able to nullify them in their ports. And that is exactly what he continued to push for. Calhoun also gave out a warning that if federal law is going to be more prominent than state level law, then one day the federal government could go so far as to abolish the institution of slavery. And so John C. Calhoun will end up resigning from the vice presidency of the United States. Now, Andrew Jackson will see this situation as ideal in the way that at this point he's very annoyed with John C. Calhoun. But at the same time, Andrew Jackson, as president of the United States, wants to make sure that this does not boil over into a full-blown crisis. And that's what he's concerned about. He wants to stop it. So he wants to stop this major dispute between the United States government and the state of South Carolina before it gets out of control. So Andrew Jackson does propose a compromise in 1832. And he states that import duties will remain in place, but he is going to reduce them. Also, any revenue collected by the federal government on import duties would be actually distributed evenly across all states. So you can see what he's trying to do. He's trying to get the southern states to realize that they are benefiting from these import duties as well, not just New England. So that was one thing that did make a lot of Southerners say, okay. Well, but it still did not overly satisfy the state of South Carolina, and it did not satisfy John C. Calhoun either. Of course, Calhoun is in this whole fight basically for one reason, to get into a fight. And South Carolina did think that these tariffs were going to be permanent. That's what they're afraid of the most. But therefore, South Carolina decides to go ahead and nullify all tariffs, and they forbade the U.S. customs officials within the state at Charleston Harbor from collecting any of the revenues from these tariffs. Okay, so the nullification crisis actually got worse. And with this in mind, Andrew Jackson openly referred to South Carolinians as, quote, unprincipled men who would rather rule in hell than be subordinate in heaven. So you can see that Andrew Jackson, although he is a South Carolinian by birth, he is getting very annoyed with the hot-headedness that South Carolinians are showing him on a daily basis at this point. And Andrew Jackson went further to say that the nullification situation was unconstitutional, and it went against the principle of one single country, and basically was trying to push the United States back into the days of the Articles of the Confederation before the U.S. Constitution came into effect in 1789. And before 1789, when you had the Articles of Confederation, the individual states did operate as a loose league of states, a confederacy, if you will. And therefore, Andrew Jackson decides he's going to send the Army and Navy to South Carolina. But first, he's going to actually send arms to what he refers to as loyalists, unionists in South Carolina. But it's those 8 U.S. Navy battleships being sent to Charleston Harbor, which is really going to make a lot of South Carolinians very angry. And then there's that force bill that authorized the president to use force against the state of South Carolina if they refuse to allow the customs duties to be collected. Okay, so as a result, the nullification crisis in South Carolina ended up being nullified itself. So let's take a look at what happened here. So there was a compromise reached in March 1833, shortly after that force bill came about, and it decided that the tariffs of over 20% would be lowered slowly until 1842. So it would take 9 years to get them down to where they were before 1816 when they're escalated. So that is quite a big concession by the U.S. government if you think about it. And South Carolina does abandon nullification. But let's be very clear, South Carolina did not walk away from this happy with the situation. And at this point, South Carolina is really looking for a way to go out the door with the sign exit above it. And by that I mean exiting the American Union. They are more skeptical than ever of the United States government. But let's look here at that image on the right. That is a statue of John C. Calhoun. Notice that cape he's got on there. And that is on top of a pillar in Charleston, South Carolina. That statue has since been removed. So here's another statue of Andrew Jackson, and again with the cape, like in the one in Charleston, but this one here is a lot lower to the ground. It's not on top of a humongous pillar. This one does still stand, and that one is inside the South Carolina State House in Columbia. So let's take a look back. So why did the nullification crisis alarm slaveholders despite it's being resolved? Because this is about tariffs, not about slavery, surely. Well, let's take a look here. There's a problem. The nullification crisis revealed that the federal government was dominant over the individual state governments, and therefore that the federal law would always be able to override state level law. South Carolinians and a lot of Southerners as well don't like that idea. And therefore, a lot of Southerners were convinced that Congress could abolish slavery itself. And all it would take would be the free states to have a majority in the United States Senate. And they could present a bill to abolish slavery. And if they have the majority, then those free senators would vote to abolish slavery. And if you don't have a president who's willing to veto that bill, then slavery's gone. Absolutely gone. And therefore, there is some real concern here that the situation is no longer tenable. And therefore, South Carolina is going to lead the southern states to looking at options for potentially leaving the American Union if this status quo continues. Okay, so here we are again. We've got the columned statue of John C. Calhoun in Charleston, which of course is no longer standing. Now, what I want to do is let's take a look here at the crisis again. Why was the Nullification Crisis viewed as one of the principal causes of the American Civil War? Why do most academic historians view it as such? Well, the answer is very simple. South Carolina, as a southern state, had openly gone against the federal government. They had defied federal law. They attempted to defy an imposed tariff. And they said to the federal government, you can't do this without our agreement. And therefore, the federal government was directly challenged by a state. And that state claiming that their power was more dominant than theirs within their state. And the federal government answered by making sure that that was not the case. And therefore, this is going to add to the Southern paranoia of this big bad federal government as they started to view it. And it is going to lead to South Carolina threatening to secede from the Union, and they don't do it. They don't do it. Not in 1832, they don't. Not in 1833 either. But it was an idea that never, ever went away. And as a result, South Carolina at this point is already on course to secede eventually. And the question is just when. All right, well, that's the end of this lecture. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've learned something. That's the main thing. And what I'll ask is if you like this video, if you could please click on the like button. And even better, go ahead and get a subscription to my channel. There will be more lectures coming up very soon. We're not stopping the 1830s. We are carrying on all the way through the American Civil War. Thank you.